Very much welcome back to the Nordic Energy Research Forum. I hope many of you also followed this live stream last week when we had a couple of really exciting and energetic discussions regarding energy and energy research. We will continue today for the coming 2 hours, so I hope you're having a really comfortable seat wherever you are. If you have any comments or any questions you would like to add to the people that are going to present and contribute to the discussion today, please write your comments and questions in the field below. I will, in a few seconds, give the word and the stage to my colleague in Oslo at Nordic Energy Research, CEO Klaus Schutte. He will give us some warm words of welcome. Hey, Klaus.
Hi, Mia, and thank you for the welcome speech. So, welcome to all around the screen to this Nordic Energy Research Forum 2021. As Mia just presented, my name is Klaus Schutte. I'm the CEO of Nordic Energy Research. Nordic Energy Research is a Nordic institution under the auspices of the Nordic Council of Ministers. We finance energy research and facilitate the energy cooperation between the Nordic countries, Norway, Sweden, Finland, Denmark, Iceland, Greenland, the Faroe Islands, and Åland, as well as between the Nordic countries and our neighboring countries in the Arctic and in the Baltic countries. The Nordic Energy Research Forum is an annual event hosted by Nordic Energy Research. The purpose of this forum is to address challenges and opportunities within Nordic Energy Research and Nordic Energy Research Corporation, showcasing the state of art of energy research collaboration in the Nordic countries. The forum gathers Nordic stakeholders in the field of energy and climate research, as well as stakeholders of the energy sectors within the industry, research, analysis, and businesses. The Nordic countries have a unique and long-standing cooperation on energy. Now it's time to further the energy cooperation with the green transition as the new framework. The Nordic countries aim at being carbon neutral while still being competitive and socially sustainable. The Nordic region is well positioned for this, but we need to act fast in order to hit the unique window of opportunities for the Nordic to lead the green transition. With the Nordic Prime Minister's joint declaration of carbon neutrality in 2019, and with the common vision of the Nordic region to become the most integrated and sustainable region in the world, it's obvious to look for Nordic solutions. So you may ask, which common knowledge base is then needed in order to choose the best solutions? As you will hear today, the Nordic Energy Research initiated the Nordic Clean Energy Scenarios project due to the need for a public available research-based analysis that gather Nordic perspective on national and regional energy system and that complement the ongoing work in the national countries. Through scenario modeling, Nordic Clean Energy Scenarios aim to identify and help prioritize necessary actions and map potential pathways to carbon neutrality. I think this work is both timely and important, considering that energy-related emissions make up almost 4/5 of the present Nordic emissions. Energy is the backbone of the green transition. So today, we'll guide you through the Nordic energy system and illustrate how the Nordic countries can achieve the Nordic vision of becoming the most integrated and sustainable in the world, and to make the green transition of carbon neutrality a reality. The first session of this forum is about considering roadmaps with departure in the Nordic clean energy scenarios and related studies. Later on session 2 today, we will discuss how to enforce social sustainability in the Nordic region with a just green transition. So I hope that you, as well as I, are excited to meet and hear the participants in today's discussion on the Nordic Energy Research Forum. So please I will wish you all a great Nordic Energy Research Forum, and back to you, Mia, in Helsinki.
Thank you very much, Klaus. This forum here in Helsinki is taking place thanks to Nordic Culture Point, where we are located today. I'm working for the Nordic Council of Ministers, and Klaus and the content in the whole is produced by Nordic Energy Research. So again, a warm welcome to participate in the coming 2 hours. The chair of the board of Nordic Energy Research, Helena Sarén, she also works at Business Finland, and she has a big know-how when it comes to the energy transition, which she will talk more about right now.
So my name is Helena Sarén, and I'm heading the carbon neutrality mission at Business Finland. And I have also had a pleasure during this year being the chairwoman of our Nordic Energy Research. And at the moment, we are in the process of renewing our strategy, which I find is very, very crucial and the most important task. Today, our forum gathers together Nordic stakeholders in the fields of energy and climate research, as well as stakeholders from the energy sector, namely research, analysis, industry, and businesses. So why are we here today? In order to reach the net zero emissions by 2050, the IEA, International Energy Agency, has determined several critical enablers, and I would like to mention here 2 of them, which one is the innovations and the second one is investments. Also, our minister was referring to investments. So the IEA states that the technologies on the market today will provide nearly all of the emission reductions needed by 2030 to put the world on the track for 2050 target. But here comes the crucial point. After 2030, getting to net zero will require widespread use of technologies still in the development phase today. In 2050, almost half of the CO2 emission reductions will need to come from technologies that are currently prototyped or demonstrated or in the piloting phase. On our way to net zero emissions globally, the need for investments is humongous. It has been estimated that between 2021 and 2030, total annual investments globally are approximately $4 trillion a year. And between 2030 and 40, this number will increase approximately to $5.5 trillion a year. And now we are talking yearly figures. Then when going forward, the estimations between 2041 and 2050, a little bit going down to $4.8 trillion, but still humongous number. And the shift when we are looking at the years and decades of 2030, there definitely electrification throughout the whole society is the key. But when looking forward, it seems to be that the end user scheme is coming more heavily to the picture, and likewise the hydrogen economy is taking much more of a stake during that decade. In 2019, the Nordic countries signed the joint declaration on carbon neutrality, committing to make the Nordic countries carbon neutral in the line with the COP21 Paris Climate Agreement. At the regional level, all 5 Nordic countries have now set carbon neutrality aims in their domestic policies. Energy sector is definitely the main driver for deep decarbonization of the Nordic economy as a whole. So in other words, energy sector is enabling other sectors to decarbonize as well. Energy, industries and transportation play a key role in decarbonizing our societies. More and more needs towards systemic, holistic solutions, including strong sector coupling, is needed. Enablers like digitalization and circularity principles need to be utilized fully. It has been estimated that digitalization's potential to help to reduce global carbon emissions is up to 15%. So 1/5, huge number again. So during 2020 and 2021, Nordic Energy Research has launched several programs and publications within the field of energy. The publications cover, for instance, or focus especially in the fields of sustainable aviation, maritime grids, and grids flexibility. Also, biomasses, power-to-X, and hydrogen economy have been tackled. The latest publication was about Nordic clean energy scenarios on carbon neutrality, and it was published actually last week. And through scenario modeling, the scenarios aim to identify and prioritize necessary actions until 2030 to achieve carbon neutrality in the Nordics. The scenarios show that carbon neutrality is possible. It's not easy, but it's doable. And we wouldn't be in the Nordics, the happiest region in the whole world, if we would not have tackled the issue of gender equality. Nordic Energy Research target is to make women in the energy field more visible, and that way encourage more women to take their career in this field as well. A couple of words about our programs. The most recent Nordic Energy Research programs include Nordgrid, as well as Nordic Maritime Transportation and Energy Research programs. In the Nordgrid, our focus is on smart electricity transportation and the future needs and challenges for the Nordic electricity systems. Transport, and especially maritime transport, is considered one of the hardest sectors of the economy to decarbonize. Since the Nordic region has a high ratio of renewable energy in its energy mix already, transport becomes one of the biggest remaining challenges in the Nordics to decarbonize. At the moment, we are living the era of large and profound global transitions. It is obvious that carbon neutrality cannot be reached without the energy sector as an enabler for the sustainable society. Like stated earlier, a large share of today's emissions can be reduced with the existing technologies and solutions. So how we can jointly in the Nordics intensify the implementation of these solutions? Obviously, we need to invest in new innovations. I believe that solving the large systemic solutions require ever larger global cooperation. Here, us in the Nordics can definitely join our forces to create sustainable future, not only in our own geographical region, but more widely out in the world. The intensified cross-industrial innovation work is therefore definitely needed. Another crucial point is the scaling up of these, sometimes even risky, new innovations on a global level. I stated in the beginning that the energy sector is an enabler for sustainable development of societies worldwide. Presently, the existing energy sector is restructuring. This creates an opportunity for new data-focused businesses and solutions as well. In the Nordics, we have an extremely good starting point for more intensified cooperation. Our long history together and trust towards other Nordics is extremely strong bond and a starting point. I would love Nordic Energy Research to continue to be an integral and an important piece of the puzzle in enabling sustainable future, not only in the Nordics, but more widely. We can jointly make things happen and strengthen the Nordics' role in the European energy system. We need to walk the talk together. So with these words, I wish you all the most interesting and inspiring and exciting Nordic Energy Research Forum. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Helena Sareen. We will pretty soon dive into the discussions regarding the carbon neutral Nordic energy system. But before that, we'll go to Greenland.
Sila pissusiata allangoriartornera akiorniarlugu nunarsuarmi tamarmi nunat avannarliit qanoq iliornersut malinnaaffigineqarput. Aammami pisariaqarpoq. Nunatsinni sila pissusiata allangoriartornera aaqqeqqissinnaajunnaalerpoq kingunerisaalu sakkortuut malunnarsererput. Siunissamilu suli sakkortunerusussaapput. Kalaalli nunaanni sila pissusiata allangornerata kinguneri ersareqqissaarput inuunitsinnilu sunniuteqartarput. Silatinguatsinni allanguutit pisarput. Nunarsua tamakkerluu kiatsikkiartorneranut sanilliullugu issittoq pingasoriaammik sukkanerusumik kiatsikkiartorpoq. Nalunarsuisarnerit aallartimmatali siullerpaamik aggustimi 2021 nunatsinni sermersuupportunersaani apinani siallerpoq. Inuiaqatigiit uuliamik ikummatissanik atuiffiungitsut anguniaraanni nutaaliorneq aningaasaliineq pisussaaffiliinerlu pisariaqartinneqarput. Nunalilu avannarlerni tamakku pikkoriffigaat.
Nunan unnarlerni nunavannarliit naalakkersuisuusa siunnersuisuqatigivinut suleqatiqarneq kalaal nunaanu pingaruteqarpoq. Ilisimat sarneq ineriartortitsineq nutaaliornerlu suleqatigiffigalugit nunat avannaamioqatigiit suleqatigut peqatigilluta CO2-mik aniatitsinerup aornartorsuutaanerata iliuseqarfiginissaa nunatta suleqataaffigissawa.
Nukik ataavartoq atorlugu ukiuni qulikkaani arlalinnit kalaallit nunaata nunats avannarliit sanilerisavut suleqatigisarpagut. Assersuutigalugu ernguk nukinganik nukissiorfipput angisooq noogimiut piginnaasaat teknologiallu atorlugit ineriartortitaavoq. Nukissiorfiit ineriartortitsineq eqqarsaatigalugu nunani avannarlerni suliffeqarfiit ataavartumik atassuteqarfigisarpai.
Nunat avannarliit naalakkersuisuisa siunnersuisuqatigivinut kalaalli nunaata suleqataanera iluaqutaallunilu nuannaarutaavoq. Ikummatissap iiffiulip ineriartortinneranut atulernissaanullu ilisimasaqalernissaq kalaalli nunaanut pingaaruteqarpoq. Tassunga assersuutaalluarpoq nunani avannarlerni imatu angallanneq aama nukissarpillugu ilisimatsarnermik pilersaarut. Pilersaarutaana kalaalli nunaata CO2-mik aniitsiffiungitsup anguniarneranut alloriarneruoq pingaarutilik.
Kalaallit nunaata nukimmik nunanut allanut tunisisartungornissaanut e-fuel pillugit teknologiit e-fuelillu niuffaffigineqarnerisa ineriartortinnerinut nunat avannarliit suleqatigiinnerat pingaaruteqarpoq. Kalaallit nunaata iluani erngub nukinganik nukissiorfiit ineriartortinneqarput ukialuillu ingerlanerini innaallagissamik pilersuinerup 90% missaa nukimmik ataavartumik pilersorneqarsinnaanissaa naatsorsuutigineqarpoq. Taamaattorlu suli kalaallit nunaani erngub nukinga annertooruyussuaq suli iluaqutigineqarsinnaavoq. Nunarsuarmi akit appasinnerpaat ilaata atorlugit kalaallit nunaat innaallagissiorsinnaagaluartoq kalaallit nunaata nunarsuarmi inississimanera pissutaalluni nukik sinneqartoorutigineqartoq atorluarneqarsinnaarpiangilaq. Hydrogen e-fuelillu allat pillugit nunat avannarliit ilisimatusarnerat suleqatigiinnerallu pissutaallutik Power to X ineriartortinneqarnera sukkasooruyussuuvoq. Taamaalillunilu kalaallit nunaata nukimmik nunanut allanut tunisisarsinnaanera imminut akilersinnaajartuarluni. Ullutsinni nukiit mingutsitsingittut atorlugit systeeminik atuiartulernermi teknologi pigineqartoqqaangerlugu CO2-mik atuiunnaariartorneq anguniarneqartariaqarpoq. Iliuseqarsinnaasut ilagaat CO2 nunap iluani toqqorneqarsinnaanera. Tamanna ima taaneqartarpoq Carbon Capture and Storage naalisarlugu CCS.
For Greenland, the cooperation in the Nordic region is a strong forum to discuss and exchange ideas on CCS. the government of Greenland, Naalakkersuisut, believes that CCS is a great tool to reduce CO2 emissions, which is why we are currently and actively looking into its potentials.
Maanna nunapsananneqaataaqanoq ittoq CO2-mik toqqorsivittut atorneqarsinnaanersoq misissorparput. Kalaallit nunaat nunaruyussuuvoq nunalu assigingittorpassuarnik iluseqarluni. Tamannalu assigingittunik periarfissiivoq. CCS atorniaraanni nukik pisariaqartinneqarpoq kalaallit nunaanilu nukik ataavartoq ermup nukinga atorneqarsinnaavoq. Sumiiffiit ilaat misissuiffigineqartut kalaallit nunaata kitaaniipput. Taakkua ilagaat nuup eqqaaniittoq ermup nukinganik pissarsifiulluarsinnaasoq. Nunat avannarliit ministeriisa siunnersuisuqatigiiffiata ataani nunat avannarliit suleqatigiinnerat aqqutigalugu ilisimatusarnermi inernerit ilisimatuussutikkut attaveqatigiittarnerit inatsisinut paasissutissat minnerungittumillu aningaasaliinerit pissarsiarineqarsinnaapput inuiaqatigiit CO2-mik aniatittiffiunginnerulernissaat anguniarlugu suliaqarnermi. Nunatsinni nukimmik ataavartumik tungavilimmik aningaasaliinerit siuarsarnissaannut nunat avannarliit suleqatigiinnerat kalaallit nunaannut pingaarutileruyussuuvoq.
That was a beautiful postcard from Greenland. Thank you very much for that one. We will soon have a panel discussion regarding how we can become carbon neutral here in the Nordics, the energy system. The green transition in Denmark and Finland, Sweden, Norway, Iceland, it can have a really big implication. If we succeed here, it will send a very strong signal to the rest of the world. How did they do it in the Nordic countries? Can we, in the Nordic, demonstrate a climate change leadership? In this session, we will discover how Nordic solutions for carbon neutrality could support the world's transition to a net zero energy system by 2050. And with me, I have Markus Wråke. He is CEO at Energiforsk. Hi, Markus. We cannot hear you.
You can't hear me?
Oh, now we hear you.
Oh, very good.
Nice to hear your voice. You will talk more about the Nordic clean energy scenarios, that's right?
That's correct. That's correct.
The stage is yours.
Okay, thank you very much, Demi. Yeah. So good morning, everyone. I'm going to share my screen here and show you a few slides. There we go. Let me know if you can't see them. So my name is Markus Wråke, as we just heard, and I'm the CEO of Energiforsk. And I've had the pleasure of leading this project called Carbon Neutral Scenarios for the Nordic region over the last 18 months, together with a fantastic team of researchers from most Nordic countries. And I'll just give you a whiff of the main conclusions there as an introduction to this session. So basically what we've done is we've looked at ways to, I'll just skip to that, to get rid of this big chunk of fossil fuels that we have in the Nordic system today, as in many or most other countries and regions in the world, of course. And we've organized the analysis around sort of 5 solution tracks, because if you look at the myriad of solutions that are available to get rid of this piece of fossil fuels, they all pretty much fall into 5 categories or tracks. And 4 of them are technical. And the first one, which is at the core of all the scenarios, we've analyzed a range of scenarios, and at the core of all of them, we have direct electrification, where you use electricity combined with a battery often to replace fossil fuels directly. An electric vehicle, good example. A second track is the indirect electrification, where we produce a fuel through electricity. So power to X, where X is a fuel. It could be hydrogen, which is then refined to other fuels, which in turn then replaces a fossil fuel. And those two together, we often talk about as electrification broadly, but as we'll see later, they have very different implications in terms of impact on the overall system. A third category of solution track is bioenergy. Of course, that's already a cornerstone of the Nordic system. We believe it's going to remain so, even in the light of the discussions around the sustainability of bioenergy production and sustainable forestry and so forth. We think that it's necessary and very attractive to continue to use bioenergy as a main source of energy for the Nordic region, and indeed for other regions also in the world. And fourth, we have carbon capture and storage, which combined with bioenergy could also produce negative emissions. So that's the BECCS abbreviation there, which can, if nothing else, can buy us time. It could reduce the pressure on other technical solutions that may be more expensive or more difficult. And indeed, if we look beyond the carbon neutrality target, most scenarios sort of suggest that we need to go actually below zero, so start removing greenhouse gases from the atmosphere, which makes the solution, of course, even more critical. And then sort of as a raster on top of all these solutions and present in all scenarios also, we have these lifestyle choices and behavioral changes that we may or may not do in order to reach the target. So depending on these sort of softer, for lack of a better word, measures and what we do in terms of our lifestyles, it may become much more difficult or much easier to reach these targets. And when you look at the scenarios that we produce and many others, really what explains kind of the different routes that we see to the same target is really what mix you have of these solutions. And I'm gonna go through a few examples to kind of show you the different implications and some of the critical conclusions that we've found in our work in this project. Starting with direct electrification, I think what is often not mentioned enough, I think, is a great benefit of directly electrified processes is the efficiency benefits that you have. And this graph shows how much energy you need to put in today to produce 1 passenger kilometer in the Nordic countries. So how much energy it takes to move 1 person 1 kilometer. And then looking in our scenario, what happens to that that energy need, you'll see a dramatic improvement in energy efficiency. And this is to a large extent thanks to direct electrification, simply because an electric engine is much more efficient than a combustion engine, or indeed a fuel cell vehicle, for example, where you have this indirect electrification. So this, I think, is kind of explains why already today the total cost of ownership, for example, for an electric vehicle is lower than for a combustion engine or diesel engine for most use cases, most people that today buy a car. And that, of course, shows up also when you look at the number of cars. This graph here shows the number of cars on the road today in 2020. You have the black and the gray, those are diesel and gasoline vehicles. And then you see a rapid shift to full electrification around 2045, 2050. And this is on the road, so this is the stock of vehicles. Of course, that means that by 2030, probably at the latest, we will see the last internal combustion engine sold in the Nordic countries in our scenarios, or very, very close to that, simply because it's already so profitable for most people to shift. And this I'm sure you've seen before in various sort of versions. What's perhaps more surprising is that we now see almost identical developments in the heavy side, so the trucking area, just as delayed by 5 or 10 years. So thanks to the rapid cost declines and the improvement in energy density of batteries, we now think that full electrification, direct electrification, makes sense for a large portion of the truck fleet if that continued sort of cost decline will materialize as we think. So, and this we didn't think 5 years ago when we did a very similar analysis. We did not see this. Then we had to rely on biofuels to a large extent, simply because we thought the batteries were too big and too heavy and too costly to use for that use case. Moving then to what perhaps is the most hyped solution right now, hydrogen and power to X, so electrofuels. I think it's certainly more than hype, thanks to the much cheaper renewable electricity that we need to produce this compared to a few years ago, and also the declining cost of electrolyzers that we need to manufacture the hydrogen. I think the conditions are now much better for hydrogen, and that combined with the much stricter targets that many countries now have makes it more likely, I think, that hydrogen and power to X will play a greater role than we perhaps thought 5 or 10 years ago. However, when we look at this from a purely cost perspective, comparing two different scenarios that both reach the targets of the carbon neutrality, it's not obvious that hydrogen and P2X fuels are the cheapest solution. As we'll see here, two scenarios where we both meeting the carbon neutrality. One where we have least cost, not a lot of hydrogen, not a lot of electrofuels. Another scenario where we have tweaked the assumptions a little bit. We see a much greater use of that category of fuels. And of course, you see the amount of energy here is quite high, and the electricity needed to produce that, of course, you have that leverage that makes the implications for the overall electricity system, fairly daunting, to be honest. We're going to have to use a lot of electricity if we choose to go very hydrogen intensive and P2X intensive route to reach the Nordic targets. If you then, on top of this, add the European strategy, which of course is very ambitious in terms of hydrogen. We have a scenario today where we have almost no hydrogen, and this graph shows electricity production in the Nordic countries, around 400 terawatt hours today. Again, looking at a scenario where we just minimize the cost to society, not a whole lot of hydrogen. Of course, we have that overall electrification that increases the need and the demand for electricity, but still manageable, I would say, between a 50 and 75% increase compared to today. But if we then look at a scenario where both the Nordic countries and the EU goes very heavily into the hydrogen route, we see a dramatic increase of electricity demand, simply because we need a lot of electricity to produce this hydrogen. And it looks like it's going to be quite cheap to produce electricity in the Nordic region compared to many other parts of Europe. Of course, this offers a great business opportunity. We can export either electricity and produce the hydrogen elsewhere, or we refine the fuels in the Nordic countries and export those fuels. It could be, likely, in the tens of billions of euros every year of export worth in these numbers. However, as you see, this is a lot of wind. The light blue and the dark blue there are wind, onshore and offshore wind. I think, it's going to be a pretty heavy challenge to get that infrastructure in place at the pace we need. You have to have the social license to do that. You have to have the acceptance of the citizens. It's a lot of non-technical barriers on top of the already pretty challenging technical environment to build this infrastructure. Moving then to bioenergy use in these scenarios, and as I mentioned, thanks to the direct electrification, not least in transport, we see reduced pressure on biofuels compared to before. That's not to say we don't need it. Here you see we have an increased use of bioenergy in the least cost scenario. You have the 2020 numbers to the left and the 2050 in a carbon neutral scenario to the right. But if we compare this to what we did 5 years ago in a project where actually the next speaker, Uwe Remmer, did a lot of the modeling, we saw a much greater need for bioenergy in transport. That's the light pink there, where we use it to produce fuels that's then used in heavy transport, trucks and shipping and so forth. And this change is actually pretty significant, as it will probably put us well below what we think is the upper boundary in terms of what we can produce sustainably in the Nordic region in terms of bioenergy. Fourth track, we have the CCS track. We believe it's necessary. Here you see captured CO2 in the Nordic region in a carbon neutral scenario. We need to pretty rapidly ramp up the capture here to meet the targets. Without this, it's going to be much more difficult and much more expensive. It's certainly possible without it, but it also means that you see the dark blue or the light blue at the bottom. We need to capture a lot of CO2 from biogenic sources to suck out basically the carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere. And, a lot of that we can also use to produce those fuels that I mentioned, because to produce a hydrocarbon from renewable sources, you need the hydrogen, and of course the carbon which we can get from these biogenic sources. And finally, to wrap up here, this behavioral change track that I mentioned, I think it's just worth saying that if you look at what you can do here, the impacts will be either so negative or very positive. And just to show the order of magnitude here, we have transport demand to the left, where you're looking at a sort of a business as usual, almost as we've done in the past in the main scenarios. But if we start then introducing measures to reduce this demand, well, we have a tremendous save, mainly actually in cost, because as we put more clean energy into transport, the actual effects in terms of climate change may not be that great, but of course in cost, this is a great gain to society. So that kind of wraps up the technical part. And if we then finalize with looking at the target areas for collaboration for the Nordic countries, I think first of all, grids, the grid planning, grids will have electrical grids and also gas grids will have to have a much greater role than we've seen in the past. That will require Nordic collaboration to get that right. We're going to have I think, a common strategy to do offshore wind, not only onshore. We have, of course, the hydrogen strategy that I think it doesn't make any sense for Norway to go one route, Denmark a second, and Sweden a third, if we're going to realize these great benefits that we see are potentially there for the Nordic countries to make use of. And finally, there are obvious sort of competitive advantages of the Nordic countries when you look at a solution like bioenergy CCS, where you have great resources in Finland, for example, where storage options are mainly in Norway. So these are kind of 4 target areas where I can see Nordic collaboration play a great role. So that wraps up my presentation. I'm looking forward to the panel discussion in a minute. Thanks a lot.
Thank you very much, Markus Wråke. I am too looking very much forward to being able to ask you questions regarding your presentation. It was very interesting. Thank you. But before we head towards the panel discussion and more information and discussion regarding this topic, we will give the word to Uwe Remme, International Energy Association. Welcome, Uwe.
Good morning, Mia, and good morning to everyone. It's a pleasure to be here today. And I would like to talk about the global perspective on reaching net zero CO2 emissions. Could you please bring up my slides?
Just a minute. There we have them. Your slides are now showing.
I guess that's, at least I see the wrong presentation. It's in Danish wind power.
We are correcting it.
Yeah, that's the one.
Yes.
Perfect.
This is the right one. I apologize for this.
No problem. Just to start. I mean, many countries, as we just learned about the Nordic countries, have announced net zero targets, also companies. And if we look all together at the global coverage of these net zero pledges that we see today, they cover around 70% of global CO2 emissions and over 70% of global GDP. So it's a wide coverage. On the other hand, only a quarter of these countries that have announced net zero pledges actually have put these ambitions into legislation today. And few are also today still not, only a few are underpinned by policies and concrete measures. So it means, and there was motivation for us to develop this global net zero roadmap to provide guidance for countries on how to reach net zero by 2050. If we look at or I have to say that the pathway that we've developed by 2050 is, of course, only one pathway how to reach net zero. What you see on this slide is a comparison of our scenario against IPCC scenarios from the special report of 1.5 degrees, comparing it against 18 scenarios that reach net zero by 2050 as well. If you just click on the thank you. What you see here is, for example, in terms of CCUS, we cover or we capture and store around 7 gigatons in 2050, of which roughly 2 gigatons are negative emissions, either from biogenic CO2 sources or direct air capture in 2050. If you look at final energy consumption, there we see that our final energy demand is in 2050 around 20% lower what we have today, despite a growth in population, despite a growth in global GDP in that pathway. And of course, it's also not only reduction or improvements in efficiency and energy service demands, but also, as Markus mentioned before, this electrification of end users. So we reach here globally a share of 50% of electricity in the final energy mix compared to 20% today. We also see the potential and role for hydrogen in the future, particularly in hard-to-abate sectors. So there we talk about long-distance transports like aviation, shipping, trucking, but also parts of heavy industries where we already use today hydrogen, but it's being produced from fossil fuels, not from low-carbon sources. So that overall in the final energy mix, we reach a share of more than 10% of final energy needs is covered by hydrogen or hydrogen-based fuels in 2050. If we move to the next slide, of course, it's important the next decade will be important for our to put the world on track to reach net zero emissions. So if we look at renewable electricity, there we've seen over the past decade a quadrupling of new installation rates for solar PV and wind, and which stands today at 200 gigawatt per year, and has to quadruple again over the next decade to 2030 to reach 1,000 gigawatt per year added annually globally. And this means basically that the largest solar PV plant that we have in operation today, which is 2.2 gigawatt, needs to be basically added every day between today and 2030 to reach this deployment level. And overall, 40% of the electricity generation in 2030 comes from solar PV and wind, which so far is actually a level that is already achieved in Denmark today. If you look at the transport sector, there we see a strong push also for electrification there. So the rate of new sales of electric vehicles, which is today at 3%, reaches 60% in 2030 in our scenario. So it's a factor 18 increase. These kind of rates are actually already achieved today in Norway and Iceland, and also Denmark has a share of 25%. So some countries are already on track in reaching these levels. And finally, also just to stress that improving energy efficiency is still important. Even if energy or electricity or other fuels are being decarbonized, it's of course important to reduce the energy intensity and to use less energy because it also reduces the need for infrastructure investments and further investment on supply side. In the end, the energy that we don't use is the safest form of energy. So in that sense, energy efficiency will still play an important role in the transition to net zero. The next slide, please. So if we look at the investments, I guess it was already mentioned earlier today. So we see a huge investment, basically more than a 4 times increase in global investments in clean energy, reaching 4 trillion in 2030, if you just click on once. And this is particularly driven by investments in renewable electricity generation, where we reach 1.3 trillion in 2030, but also investments in infrastructure. So we'll be talking about electricity grids, but also new infrastructure needed, for example, for hydrogen. We will reach overall investment needs of 900 billion in 2030. And we also see investment needs on the end use side, various forms of appliances, but also in industry, which overall account for 1,700 billion in 2030. And if you look at these investments, we also did analysis together with the International Monetary Fund. If you click once, where we estimated what is the overall economic impact of this transition to net zero. And actually, our analysis shows that actually it has positive benefits on GDP. So we see actually an average increase over the next decade of global GDP of 0.4%. So overall, 4% increase in absolute GDP in 2030. And that roughly translates into an increase of global GDP, which corresponds to the GDP of the Nordic, or 3 times the GDP of the Nordic region today. So the transition to net zero can also have economic benefits for many countries. If you move to the next slide, please. And if you look on the technology side, particularly looking at technology innovation, many of the technologies that we need to reach net zero over the next decade are already developed today. So we talked about energy efficiency, we talked about renewable electricity. So these technologies are already developed today. But if we move beyond 2030 and moving towards 2050, we see that actually if we want to reach net zero by 2050, half of the CO2 reductions have to come from technologies that are today not yet commercially available. So they're either at a demonstration or prototype or even prototype stage today. So here we're actually talking about technologies like hydrogen, like carbon capture, utilization and storage, so CCUS, but also bioenergy and parts of electrification. If you click next. So you see here some examples of these technologies in these areas. For example, we have to, for example, improve battery weight to bring down, to open the opportunity to use electricity in various transport applications. Also, electrolyzers need to be scaled up dramatically over the next decade or the next decades, so that overall there's quite still need for pushing technologies today at an early development stage further. And this means, of course, that we have to also increase RD&D spending. So the current budgets that have been proposed by governments are around $25 billion over the next 10 years. We estimate that overall $90 billion would be needed in our transition to net zero over the next decade. And of course, international collaboration is also important in this context to faster develop these technologies. We also did a site analysis looking at if there's less international cooperation, which actually would delay the achievement of net zero by several decades. If we move to the next slide, please. And if we look at the fossil energy sector, of course, we see a drastic reduction in fossil energy use, as illustrated here in the case of oil, which drops from 88 million barrels per day production to 24 in 2050 in our net zero pathway, which of course has energy security benefits for many countries that are relying today on fossil energy imports. But at the same time, if we click next, we also see that the production is concentrated in very few regions, basically low-cost producers like the OPEC, so that the OPEC share exceeds 50% in global oil production, which is the highest share that such a high share we've not seen so far in history. At the same time, if we click next, we also see that there's an increase in demand for critical minerals, particularly if we look at technologies like batteries, several solar PV and wind, which of course can also raise energy or material security concerns, so to speak of. So that's also something that needs to be addressed. And if you click next, please. And of course, if you look at the electricity system, there's also the challenge to integrate increasing shares of every renewables in the system. So we see in 2050 that on global average, solar PV and wind provide 70% of the electricity generation. Total renewables reach more than 90% in the mix. So this, of course, requires also integration measures like demand response, like batteries, flexible generation. So the energy security is not something that goes away if we move to net zero in the future, but it shifts to different parts or different aspects of the energy system. If we move to the next slide, please. And if you click once. And so just to conclude, what we've done in this roadmap is to also to look at what are the intermediate milestones for different technologies between today and 2050. And you see it here for different sectors and technologies. If you click once again. And so it's illustrated here, for example, for hydrogen, that we see a massive ramp up needed in the deployment of electrolyzers over the next decade, reaching 850 gigawatts in 2030. And that just compares to an installed electrolyzer capacity for the energy sector of 0.3 gigawatts today. If you click once or twice, and yeah, we see also in other areas massive ramp-up deployment needed. Also, we are phasing out coal-fired power generation by 2040 globally. And as I mentioned before, we also see a very high share, or basically electricity generation is largely dominated, or is dominated by renewables, and solar, PV, and wind account for 70% of the generation. So we see a drastic change of the way the energy system looks in the future. Compared to today, and with that I stop here, and very much looking forward to the panel discussion. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Uwe. This was really interesting. Thank you for these slides. I hope it is available for everybody who wants to take a better look at these slides to get them later on. Just get in contact with Nordic Energy Research. Now with us, I also hope we have my former colleague, Kevin Jonsen from Nordic Energy Research. Hey, Kevin, how are you doing?
We're doing fine here in Oslo.
Yes, welcome. It's time for us to have a panel debate with you, Ove, and Markus. And I will start with the big questions, and then we will go a little bit into a smaller region as the Nordic. If we start on a global scale, which clean energy resources have the potential to play a major part in this global energy mix? And I will start with giving this question to you, Ove, presenting based on the presentation you gave.
Yes, thank you very much, Mia. It of course depends very much on the regional resources available. But if you look at the overall global mix, we see really that renewables will play a dominant role in the primary energy mix in the future. As I mentioned before, they dominate also electricity generation mix. Actually, solar PV becomes by 2050 the largest primary energy carrier in the world, followed by bioenergy. Of course, if you look at bioenergy, there are of course concerns about sustainability of sourcing these bioenergy resources, taking into account biodiversity, but also land availability and the impact on food production. But overall, we see really a switch from fossil energies, which account for two-thirds of the primary energy mix today, to renewables. Then, of course, if you look further at the final energy mix, we also see a strong push for electrification, as also mentioned by Markus in his presentation, but also the opportunities to use hydrogen in different parts of the energy system, particularly there where direct electrification is more difficult. So, for example, we see in our scenario that in the shipping sector, more than half of the energy, the fuel demand in shipping can be covered by hydrogen or hydrogen-based fuels like ammonia. In the future, it's similar for aviation, where we see a share of 1/3 of synthetic kerosene being produced from hydrogen, covering global aviation fuel demand in the future.
What are your comments, Kevin?
For the Nordic region, I believe that we will see a lot of direct electrification, as Markus has talked about earlier today. And as we know from the Nordic countries, we know that there's a lot of potential for especially for wind, both offshore and onshore wind. And then in the later years, in 2030 and 40 and 50, we will also see a higher share of solar energy also being cost effective.
And Marcus, what are your take on this?
Well, there's not much to add. I think Uwe and Kevin described it well. I think that, of course, the Nordic region, we're endowed by tremendously good resources, both hydro, of course, and wind, that I think will play a key role. It's just obvious that I think that the demand for electricity, clean electricity, both within the Nordic countries and from the rest of Europe, will likely be so high. So I think the limitations for new wind power will not primarily be from lack of demand or economics. It will be for other reasons, notably acceptability and those sort of non-technical issues that we face. But the potential, I think, for those sources are really high in the Nordic region.
You talked a lot about the next steps would have to be within the Nordic grid. Could you open this up a little bit? Is that where the innovations are right now, and where we have to put more investments?
Yeah, I think since we see especially direct electrification being so important for basically all the scenarios, and if you then add a fair bit of potentially indirect electrification, it's hard to see that you can do this without a much stronger electrical grid. So it's kind of a no-brainer and a no-regret solution to invest heavily in strengthening the grids, and that is both locally, which is a local issue and regional issue, but also nationally and potentially internationally. The transmission between countries and interconnectors between the Nordic countries and continental Europe will have to be, I think, built out in a way that we haven't seen for many years, and that it does make sense to do that without a common Nordic, at least collaborative effort, because it will be inefficient and more expensive if we do that on our own, each country.
Kevin, what do you think?
Could I ask Marcus a question yet?
Of course.
Sure. So first of all, I would like to say that it's been a pleasure to work with some of the best energy researchers and analysts in the Nordic countries. I hope that if there's any decision makers following this forum, I hope that the main message that we can give is that achieving carbon neutrality in the Nordics are possible. It's something that we can do. It has some discussions that we need to take to get there, and the pace needs to increase, but it's something that we actually have the potential for and that we can do. And we need to take those discussions and discuss those between the Nordic countries. How do we get there? As Marcus touched upon earlier, for instance, Power-to-X. What kind of common vision do the Nordic countries have for Power-to-X, having in mind this tremendous impact this could have on the total energy system? So, but the question I would like to ask to you, Marcus, is, Uwe, you've looked into this global energy system and doing this on a global level. So what kind of benefits do you think that we get from looking at this from the global overview? And to you, Marcus, what kind of insights do we gain from looking at the more regional perspective rather than at the global whole?
Do you want to go first, Uwe, or starting with the global picture?
Yeah, sure. Just taking the example, we just talked now about the indirect electrification, also Power-to-X and hydrogen. Of course, this also opens opportunities for regions that have vast and excellent renewable resources to export them in the future, because domestic demand might be not that high. For example, if you look at Australia, if you look at the Middle East, but also in Latin America, looking at Chile. So they have got excellent solar PV and wind resource and could in the future export these renewable electricity that they don't need in form of hydrogen or hydrogen-based fuels. And that way, reduce the pressure in regions which maybe have less good opportunities to produce domestically hydrogen to use or to import these resources. For example, if you look at projects being discussed today for Japan importing hydrogen, but also Europe is looking into it. So that could be an alternative in a way to electrification, to indirectly take advantage of some of the excellent renewable resources we have around the world.
Yeah, and I just building on what Uwe just said, I think all issues in the end become in a way local. Yeah, you have to, when you build stuff, it's often up to decision maker and the citizen of where you're going to build that stuff that has the final say, right? So unless you, without understanding the sort of local and regional context, it's really difficult to sort of understand what pathways are both, of course, economically and technically attractive, but also feasible from, when you take all the aspects into account. And I think hydrogen is a good example of where you need both these perspectives, because as I mentioned in my presentation, it doesn't look obviously the most cheapest solution for the Nordic countries, if you look at it in isolation, to go down sort of a heavy hydrogen-centered transformation route, because we have other solutions available. But when you then consider the broader EU strategy that I mentioned, which at least right now looks very focused on hydrogen as a centerpiece of that transformation, given that the fact that there are less other options than using hydrogen as a carrier in the European context, and you see that in other regions, as Uwe mentioned. And when you think about that, that has implications, for example, in terms of what infrastructure will be available for hydrogen versus other solutions, and what the costs of electrolyzers will how they will develop, which of course then makes the route more or less attractive for a Nordic context. So I think you need, and I guess that's what you're after, you need, I think, both the global picture, symbolized here by Uwe, and more regional, local one, perhaps symbolized by me. And I think it's a good way of, I think, of approaching these issues.
What are your thoughts, Kevin?
Yeah, I agree. I think that of course, we need to have the global picture to kind of get the overview of where the technologies are going on a global level. But then, as Marcus explained, we also need to see how that can be implemented on a local level and what that means for our local communities.
Thank you very much. If you have questions or comments, do not hesitate to write them in the field down below this, where you are watching and following this live stream. I know we have a few of you already participating. I'll soon ask your questions as soon as I get them over here. But before that, I want to take a step back, looking at what Marcus was talking about in his presentation, because you mentioned behavioral change on several levels. What kind of behavioral changes is it that you are referring to? Where is it that we have to start doing something?
Well, I think it's helpful to look at behavioral change in different time dimensions, what you can do. The easiest is to make it easier to choose sort of a clean technology over a dirty one to reach the same kind of service as we do today. Again, electric vehicle is a good example. It's got very similar functionality as a gasoline vehicle, but by introducing policies and innovation, you can make it easier for people to kind of change their behavior a little bit so they can buy an EV over a diesel engine. Much more difficult is to change people's behavior in terms of how much transport you actually demand. Moving first of all to a different mode, not using a passenger vehicle of your own, but perhaps using a train or a bus or and further along the line also reduce the need to travel at all, which may require a change of preferences. So we now these Swedish people tend to value going to Thailand every winter very highly. Perhaps we need to change the preference that we do not value that so highly over staying at home or choosing to spend our money otherwise. And I think these are very different sort of dynamics in terms of what you can and cannot do and how quickly things can move when you talk about behavioral change. I think you need to kind of separate them. But of course, what I showed in our scenarios is kind of focused on the energy intensive and material intensive parts of the consumption that we have that underlie the scenarios. Transport demand is a very good example, where most of the infrastructure planning that we have in place today in the Nordic region rely on projections that are based on how we've moved in the past. How many passenger kilometers do we get out of 1,000 inhabitants, for example? And I think it's fair to criticize some of that, say we need to bend those curves down. It doesn't make sense to have the same kind of passenger demand for every 1,000 inhabitants as we did in the past. So that's what we've kind of focused on when we try and quantify these.
What are your take on this, Uwe?
Yeah, I fully agree what Marcus said. I mean, behavioral change is of course important to reach that zero emissions, whether it's globally or whether it's on a national, local level. And some of these behavioral changes are a bit more really on the consumer itself. So if we talk, for example, adjusting temperature settings in buildings, whether it's heating or cooling. The same stand for if we talk about transport. Also there's also the need to have these alternative transport modes available. So for example, shifting from aviation for our short distance flights to high-speed rail. Of course, it means that we have to invest and build up these rail infrastructure. Consumer behavior can also, of course, reduce the energy demand, which I guess is again important in the context also of energy efficiency and the entire kind of upstream energy infrastructure that we need in the future, particularly if we talk about the electricity system. And I mean, just to give you some examples, we also looked at different behavioral measures to reduce CO2 emissions. For example, if we globally introduce a speed limit of 100 kilometers per hour on motorways, we estimated that would reduce CO2 emissions in 2030 by 140 megatons per year. I mean, adding up these different kind of behavioral changes, which are small steps, of course. Still, these small steps require contribution efforts by everyone, could help also to reduce CO2 emissions and to achieve our net zero targets.
Kevin, would you like to add something to this?
Yeah, I think first of all, I think that we've got a responsibility as citizens. I think what kind of culture we strive for and what we think of as a good life has a large impact on what we do, how we consume, what we use our money for, and that also translates into the energy system. So of course, there's a lot of potential for changes. I think we've also seen for the last year that there's a lot of possibilities that we haven't really looked into earlier that we could do now. For instance, having this forum digital rather than physical. But also, I think what we see from the scenarios is that behavioral change is not a silver bullet. We still need all those other approaches as well. We still need the direct electrification, the power to X, the bioenergy, and the carbon capture on top of the behavioral change to reach these targets. And I think that's quite an important takeaway as well.
Thank you. We have a question from the audience. What are the challenges of heating electrification? Would you, Marcus, like to answer that?
The different solution tracks that I mentioned, of course, go to this question a little bit. In direct electrification can be used in many processes, including for some industrial heat, for sure. We see fairly high potential actually to use both the existing types of heat pumps, but also a bit further online, higher efficiency heat pumps applied and deployed more widely in industry. So we could see direct electrification of also industrial heat. And of course, we have, a significant potential in the Nordic region for residential heating in terms of the district heating networks that we have to use electricity to fuel heat pumps that can then lift ambient heat from, say, hydrogen production that produces a lot of excess heat to heat our homes and our cities. But there are also limitations to electrification in terms of heat. And maybe that's the question sort of point here, that makes it also attractive to, for example, look at other tracks like PTX fuels, where you need lots of energy in a very short time, or you need extremely high temperatures. Sometimes direct electrification is not the most attractive route. Then you need a fuel, something that you burn. Could be a synthetic fuel, or could be bioenergy, or the other types of fuel. So that's why we see this kind of mix of the different solution tracks. But it's a good question.
Yes, it is. Uwe, would you like to add something to this?
I guess Mark's very well described some of the various aspects. Maybe just to add that the in regions or countries with a very seasonal heating or cooling pattern, of course, or particularly heating pattern, if you talk about heating, that we could also see, of course, fully moving towards electrification can also increase the pressure on the electricity system. So there we also have to look into measures to increase the flexibility of the electricity system, or to look in parts or regions, also look at alternative heating or complement the heating system with other components, for example, district heating, where it makes sense in terms of density. So yeah, so it's not only the fuel side, I would say, but also has to look at the overall electricity system design. If we talk about electrification of heating, what are the advantages and potential challenges?
Thank you very much. Unfortunately, we have to end the discussion here because it's time for us to do a wrap up and have a really short break. But first, I'll give the word to you, Kevin. Would you like to add something or summarize this discussion in a few sentences?
Well, I think, as I stated earlier, I think the main message here is that achieving Nordic carbon neutrality is possible. It's something that we can do. We have most of the tools already, but we need to start to implement them, and we need the pace to increase. We also need to have some discussions on a Nordic level on where we want the energy system to be in the future. And I think and I hope that this report could be the starting point for that discussion.
Very much thank you, Ove, Markus, and Kevin, and you who are following us from your own screens, wherever you are. Please stay put, because in a few minutes we will be back with the next session where we will focus on sustainability when it comes to energy. But first, go and take a short break and have yourself a cup of coffee. Welcome back. I hope you have been able to walk around a little bit and stretch, because we are going in for a really interesting last session here at the Nordic Energy Research Forum. We're going to focus on sustainability within the energy sector. First, we will start with a greeting from Faroe Island.
Det var i samtøyne. Det hadde vært trenden rundt omvåknet av tøyene. Og andre samfunn har meldt ut vi at de kunne ta i 2040, 2045, 2030. Men vi tenkte, let oss vite og arbeide frem mot at gjøre det sin fyrr. Ta kunne jeg se om en visjon, om at man mente at landet kunne godt bli alt som det var av landet grønt i 2030. Og det var faktisk arbeid etter så, ja.
Det viser jeg, vi har utrolig gode ressurser i Førjøen. Vi har vind av flere støven og med for 20 meterskunde. Vi har nekva vattnorsk og tøka. Vi har parster sølorsk og øsne, og vi har aldorsk og øsne. Og så arbeider øsne vi rettelig spennende tøkene som sjøavfallsorsk. Og her med annet en rettelig spennende verskatland vi har karrande i Vestmannsund, hver det nek dreker som kommer køyre bottnet. Og det som vi har råknet fram til er, hvis vi får utnyttet sjøavfallet optimalt, så kunne vi spære faktisk rettelig nekvar uiløv i sol og vind.
Vi tar en enkla elveiding. Elskipene enkel i Førjøen, og her vi det eisende enkelt at gjøre røndreim som slam. Tog at vi tar ikke en rikve av byråkratiske prosedurer omkring disse vidskiftene. Det har vi tiltrekk samstarver i en stor mål. Tog at det gjør enkelt og bøylet og kjøtt. Høyre lite land, men vi komplett land. Til small scale med full scale. Det vil si at du kan testa på en bøylig måte og få urslit som rikker ut i store systemer.
Tar man for ut og skal bygge til dømes av en vindorsk og park, så det øyelig området der man hever et samstarv i følelsesstenen og høyre deg og gjennom av sammålene. Det er etnast særlig vel tjokk. Det er det. Føringer rettelig påstyrt at det kommer til hverandre orsk og EU-kippa seg. Det er man, og man vil øyla gjerne til å slippe av i oljene som det er primære, og at du baker egnet kjelter. Den største avgjørelsen det at vi har ikke kapler til nabolanden tjokken. Det er at vi skulle til øynekvart hos stabilisere elkjerver tjokken, og det øyla tropult da man hever nekva ustabila vindorsk inn i kipane. Det det øyla området, jeg vil si all nøye tjokken å bygge speklig, så vi lærer kipane å kjenne og gjøre det nøye og atøysen til å stabilisere elskipene så hver som vi bygger ut i hverandre orsk. Det er et myndet ikke alt avgjørende. Og i øyne er akkurat åttjønne Sorøytene. Her har vi en øyelig spennende verskatland i gang, hver vi bygger ut kraft ved vindorsko, og så gjør vi stabiliserende tiltøk, altså vi nødger tøkene som skal gjøre det så at vi kunne køyre ved vatten og vind og sol bære. Det er at vi skulle utfase de dieselorskene som køyrer og øyne i det. Man sier Sorøyten en løytel ått, som førger en løytel land, og så gjør så han lærte om vi får Sorøy, han kommer vi bruke i mednøysen og i førgene. Halt nudge tøkne og at vi rønta går til i førgen. Det er alltid Syrasens det er ambisjoner vi har i førgen, og at det er sånn førger som et land hvor de kan prøve seg tøkne.
Vi kunne faktisk være vidt til å skapa løsner for de store landene. Landet til åkken blir kjent for å være visionært og en gondan, og det kan man være fegnast om. Og ingen å lytte til at det går opp.
Again, wonderful pictures, this time from the Faroe Islands. We are now going to start discussing sustainable energy and how it is possible to make sustainable energy for all. The Nordic Council of Ministers, our vision is for 2030 that we should be here in the Nordic countries the most sustainable and integrated region in the world. To be able to become the most sustainable region in the world, we need to transform the energy sector. It plays a key role in the whole transition. Phasing out fossil fuels is one of the most burning issues of our time, and the Nordic region, we have a lot to contribute to this transition. But when we are doing this switch to doing the Green Deal as in the European Union has stated in their strategy, it is very important that we also think a lot about equality, diversity, and inclusion, and how we incorporate these values and issues in the process. This is what we're going to talk more about the coming half an hour. And with me, I have now Tanja Winter. Welcome.
Thank you.
Tanja, you are professor for the Center for Development and the Environment at the University of Oslo. That's right?
Yes.
And you're also heading the research center Include.
Yes, that's right.
So socially just energy transition is a very important topic in everything you do, right?
Yes, it's our leading guiding question for everything we do. So it's a pleasure to be here and share some of our results.
Yes, please do. The floor is yours.
Thank you. Yes, so if I can get my presentation shown, it would be great. Right. Yes, so I thought I would go directly to a concrete example to illustrate why this socially just energy transition is important, if I can have the next page. So we did a study a while back on in-home displays in Norwegian homes. So this device is to show the family, the household, how much electricity are we using at the moment and what will be our consumption over a week, over a month. And we tested this out in different families. And in one group, consisting of detached houses, so relatively wealthy, this device was more or less treated as a toy. So these men, it was often men, and they were particularly interested, so not necessarily a typical Norwegian, but they would have already one or two of these from before, and they would more compare how would this show consumption compared to the last one. Not having any effect on their energy consumption because they already were fully informed about what consumption they had. Next slide, please. Whereas on the east end of Oslo, people living in flats, here the reception of these devices was very different. So they would first test out appliances, how much is the stove using, etc. And then they would keenly follow consumption and see how much had been gained over a year, over a month. And some would even say, I get control over my life because I know now what the bill will be towards the end of the month. So a very different reception. But then when we asked them, would you have paid 1,000 kroner to purchase this device? They would say no, they would never do that. Priorities count. So they would not invest in it, but they had good use of it. And compared to neighbors, they saved at least 10% of the consumption of the following year. And we also observed that they have much less flexibility compared to detached houses in terms of investing in energy technology, so heat pumps and solar panels due to regulations and everything. And also the local regulations on being quiet after 8 o'clock in the evening. So they could not run their washing machines after 8 p.m. Next slide, please. And this experience from the detached houses led us also to become interested now in the new regime for tariffs, grid tariffs in Norway coming from January already. So this will now be based on the capacity. So how much capacity has each household demand for? So first, the fixed amount will then be based on the measured previous consumption. So for a big house, it will be more because you use more electricity at the same time, whereas a little flat would use less. So this will now be graded compared to today, where there's a fixed amount for everybody. And the other part of this tariff will be consumption per unit, as today, but now with a time of use prices possibility. So if you see to the right here, the goal is here over a day to avoid those peaks in the morning and in the afternoon and make people even out consumption. Run, for example, charge their electric cars during nighttime. Next slide, please. So we asked now in an ongoing project in Include, what kind of households can actually tap the benefits of these changed tariffs? And we recently went to Tromsø in the northern Norway to do interviews and ask these questions, also making people reflect on their own and people they know of and who would be in a good position. And what came out, not surprisingly, is that the wealthy people have more possibility to adjust to this kind of tariff. those who are interested and knowledgeable in smart technology, and these often go hand in hand, and you need money to invest in those technologies. And also those with flexible work hours and living in the south of Norway was mentioned, thinking about weather changes. So in Norway, heating is really, electricity is the main source for heating all homes in Norway. It's really the dominating way. So we could regard flexibility also by drawing on the literature here as a form of capital in itself. So seen from the household level, this is a sort of capital that is unevenly distributed in the population. Next slide, please. So I will end with this slide here. And so a key question for us is whether these new tariffs will enhance socially just transition, or will it, on the contrary, produce more inequality? And it is really important because we already know that energy poverty exists in Norway. It's not mentioned in policy, but we have studies showing that particularly recipients of social support and elderly people living on their own in old houses, that they are particularly at risk, living today already with freezing in the winter because of the high costs. And on a more general level, we have a recent study showing that 7% of Norwegian households had problems serving their bills already in 2019. And now we know the electricity price in the market is extremely high. And when this tariffs comes on top of that, it can be really extreme results in terms of people's bills. So in Include then, we have this energy justice framework where these three words, what and who and how, are somehow the key. So we would look at the distribution for different groups, but also, and now that the grid companies are making out the details in these new tariffs, whose interests are being acknowledged in those processes, who have the possibility to become that smart consumer that they envisage. And also the procedural justice on how are decisions made, who are involved in just both making the regulations for this and also being informed and influencing on the process. And the general picture in Norway, at least, is that consumers have very weak decision-making power in this regime, which is very centralized. So I would like to end with this quote from one of the flat families we met yes. We asked, what do you think about this time of use electricity tariffs changing over the day? And one person here, having a spouse from Gambia, she said, I don't want that. I wouldn't stand the same level of conflict as we had at a time when making a phone call was cheaper after 5 p.m. So reminding us that electricity is a very social phenomenon. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Tanya. This was really interesting. And we will continue talking about this topic in a few minutes, and I'll also present some questions for you. But before that, I want to introduce Julia Kierkegaard to the audience. Julia, are you with us?
Yes, I am.
Hi, welcome. You are a senior researcher at the Technical University of Denmark at the Department for Wind Energy. And you will present a topic about the paradigm shift in Danish wind power.
Right. So if I can get my presentation on the screen. But thank you, Tanya. It was really interesting because my presentation will also relate a bit to the issue of to the tariff system, which I think in social science is not often looked at, but it's quite important actually to take into account also for how it can include and exclude certain actors.
Julia, could you put your microphone a little bit closer to your mouth?
Yeah.
Yeah, thank you.
Is that better? I cannot see. Okay, that's my presentation. Yes, so hello everyone. I'm a senior researcher at DTU Wind Energy. We just formed a new section called Society, Market and Policy, where we actually try to conduct multidisciplinary or even interdisciplinary research amongst social scientists, including geographers and economists and sociologists and political scientists. And this presentation is going to be based on on a project we conducted called Wind 2050, where we detected what we call a paradigm shift in Danish wind power. And I'll try to explain what that is. So next slide, thank you. Right. So I guess people attending here today have heard about Danish wind power. It has sort of become a national brand for Denmark. Maybe some of you haven't heard about that we have an increasing issue with local opposition against wind power. And we try to explain that by going back in time, actually taking back a few steps. So instead of going into the rhetoric of NIMBYism, which is stands for not in my backyard, we try to understand why is it actually that people have become more and more concerned over wind power in Denmark. Okay, next slide. Right. So what we find in Denmark, at least, there's been a tendency to talk about the green transition as something that can be fixed by engineers and economists, or at least it's very much about technology when we talk about it. But this increasing social opposition has sort of left the sector and the researchers with a conundrum. So how can we explain that? And part of our argument here is that, well, actually the very material dimension of the tariff system and the technology itself and the science behind it actually has pushed towards or co-created this local opposition. So we take what we call a socio-technical lens, where we are trying to look at the entanglement with the social and the technical and also the economic. So we try to have a sort of an assemblage or a network understanding of the wind power sector, because it has to be created for a lot of tools and devices, but it also has to be maintained. And somehow our wind power assemblage has been destabilized through local opposition, and now we need to sort of reconfigure that assemblage. So we need to understand wind turbines as a sort of a hybrid engineering problem that is not just technical but also social. Next slide. Right, so let us take a few steps back. So everybody knows that the cost of wind energy has decreased tremendously, and it has become competitive with fossil fuels even. That was not how it was back when it all started back in the 19th century. And so how is that? That is actually has been very much driven by a cost efficiency logic. Engineers who really have been very good at and efficient in optimizing the turbines, driving down the levelized cost of energy. And that has been done really with a focus on increasing hub height, the power rating, and rotor diameter. So that means that to reduce or increase the wind turbine energy capture, we will then decrease the cost of energy. And that has in turn also really made a dramatic shift in technology size or the scale of turbines. You can see they're pretty small back in the 19th century and the 1990s. And now this is actually a figure from 2017, and it's already outdated. So we already have wind turbines the size of 16 megawatts in production, and they are designing up to 30 megawatt turbines now. So they increase in scale, and it doesn't seem to stop anytime soon. Next slide. Right. So let's look at very briefly at the history of Danish wind power development in Denmark. So it really started as based in the Danish folk high school tradition. We had a very famous priest called Grundtvig, who constructed this notion of folksy democracy and also the cooperative movement. So, and there, based on this folk high schools, people would go together, neighbors and so on, and invest in small turbines, experimenting with how it worked. And so it was very much based in local communities and small-scale developments. And back then it was really a matter of forming a resistance against nuclear power and fossil fuels. But what we see today, as I just mentioned, is that we now see increasing local opposition towards wind power. So, and from our interviews, with local community members and others, it's really being problematized as this shift from pure ideology back in the 70s, 80s, and then towards pure capitalism, or that is how people talk about it. These are, it's actually direct quotes, what they say here. So it is being problematized how wind as a common good that we all share is becoming this tradable commodity that then can be capitalized by certain actors but not by others. So there's like an underlying debate over who should own the wind or the right to reap the profits. Next slide. So in our research, we've dived into 5 dimensions of this wind power assemblage, looking into 1, the capitalization instruments, 2, turbine technology, and with that we mean particularly the size, the scale of wind turbines, 3, capital investment, 4, regulation and governance of finance, and 5, the ownership modes. And I will not be able to go into any details here, but really the main message is if we now I cannot see the slide, but anyway, back in the original, back in time, subsidies were fixed. You got a fixed tariff for electricity produced, which made the investment more safe for small-scale developers. Turbine technologies were really at more smaller and more simple, so it didn't cost us much. So that's the capital investment. It was a relatively low capital investment required, and it was also relatively easy. This is dimension number 4, to get a cheap mortgage loan and so on. And then finally, there was room for these local cooperatives. It was really this bottom-up process of developing wind power. And there was also a requirement that there should be local residency of the owner. Let's move to the next slide, because here we can see how that assemblage has, like in all the dimensions, changed dramatically. So we've moved towards a more market-based tariff over time, now set even by competitive tendering bids. That increases the risk of investment. And then with larger turbines, they're also more they're larger and more complex. That then leads on to higher capital investment requirements. That's dimension 3, and then that has also made it more risky and difficult and complex to get financing from banks and so on. And then what we see now is really the shift from small-scale local developers to these large corporate actors. And that is what people, when we talk to them, really are problematizing. Is it really meant to be only the large corporate players that can play a role in the transition? Is this sustainable, that local communities are excluded from co-investing, co-developing wind power? So it has raised all these concerns that you can see in the middle, and that's like at the basis of it is really like this shift or seeming shift from ideology to profit and capitalism, that people don't see themselves as in the same way as in the beginning. Next slide. So just to conclude, we are talking in our research paper about like 3 entangled shifts. So the paradigm shift, with that we mean the shift from local cooperatives to corporate players, this exclusion processes that have really been set in motion, also due to the technological development of wind power and wind turbines, and the overall regime shift towards renewable energy, where wind power has become this critical infrastructure. So we want to raise awareness of the social material implications of techno-economics, that this focus on levelized cost of energy has been really instrumental in driving forward wind power, but then at the same time, it might even exclude small-scale actors that then causes more local opposition. So we call for more reflexivity about this, also the contextual nature of these dynamics. We need to be aware that technology can be an enabler for a transition, but also might exclude certain actors. I have one final slide. So wind turbines might create wicked problems, or we need to have this more holistic perspective, understanding that technology actually matters, and also the economics behind it, and how the tariff system is also construed, as Tanya just mentioned as well. So even or if we don't do that, we will not understand how certain actors or entities are affected by these processes. And so Labouchier and Nadai is a couple of scholars who wrote also related a book about related issues, how transitions might actually create inclusion and exclusion processes, and we need to become more reflexive about that to ensure sustainability. So that was it.
Thank you very much, Julia. If you who are watching have questions or comment that you would like to ask or add to this, please write down below in the comment field, because we will have a short but intense discussion after the third presenter, who is Anders Tönnesen from the Center for International Climate Research. Anders, are you here with us? Hi.
Yes, I am. Thank
Welcome. You will
Thank
talk
you.
about social justice in the transformation of Norwegian urban mobility.
Yes, thank you. If I could have my presentation. I'm a researcher at CICERO, Center for Climate Research in Oslo, and I'm also part of the Include Center mentioned by Tanya. So we work in accordance to the same framework there. So I will talk about how we transform the urban areas in Norway. So in Norway, we have worked for a decade in accordance to the so-called zero growth goal. So if you switch. So the goal states that all growth in private car traffic in urban areas is to be absorbed by public transport, cycling and walking. And it means that the driving length of person cars, is not to increase regardless of whether it's fossil or electric cars being used. So it doesn't distinguish, it just says that the driving length in urban areas is not to grow. And we have implemented the so-called urban growth agreements as one of the most important tools for Norwegian authorities to reach this goal. So next slide. So very much effort has been devoted to the 9 largest urban areas in Norway, and also the 4 largest of them. So that raises many social issues or social justice issues. What about the next level cities, the smaller cities in Norway? How are they gonna transition? How is that gonna be? So it has been pushed forward, increasingly attention towards the smaller cities in Norway now. And if you take the next slide, one important dimension of these agreements is that they're not only encompassing the core city, but the surrounding municipalities as well. And this has changed from when the agreement started. You can see Trondheim here, first agreement for Trondheim area. To the right was rather small, but it was expanded to also encompass the surrounding municipalities. And in Trondheim, that worked well. But in Bergen, there was a lot of resistance from the municipalities around the city, among others relating to toll roads and land use management, or them being steered in terms of how they were able to develop their land within the municipality. So next slide. This shows toll road payment, and in Norway it has for sure increased over the last decades. And we had a toll road uproar in 2019. And if you take next slide, I would say that this uproar is also an uproar against how money are being used, because using toll roads for urban development issues and public transport infrastructure, that's sensitive. In Norway, it's being done because we have this law stating that if it's benefiting the transport system as a whole, then you can use money in that way. but it's also very sensitive. So I think that the politicians in Norway have been increasingly aware of this sensitivity and focused more on the level of cost for the solutions financed by toll roads. And presently, the toll road uproar has somewhat is not that up in front, I would say. So if you take the next slide, these agreements, they also finance public transport infrastructure. And when we have done our interviews, it's also been clear that some of the resistance relates to how these solutions fit in the urban landscape. This is an example of the public transport system in Nord-Jæren, a new bus lane in the middle, and very many people referred to this creating barriers and being a quite brutal infrastructural project, not in sync with the city as such. So that's also important to understand the opposition towards such agreements. Next slide. And to the left, you have the planning map of how the Oslo region is being planned in terms of creating compact land use around public transport nodes. And that is very good for reducing emissions and creating an effective transport system. But it also creates winners and losers, as Tanya referred to as the distributional effects. Because to the right, you see Lillestrøm being one of these nodes. These are prices for houses decreasing with increasing distance from the public transport node. And as you can see, this effect has become larger with the years, because as you develop more and more effective and high quality transport nodes, you also create winners in the dwelling markets. Next slide. And this is a map of Nord-Jæren around the Stavanger area to the left and the Oslo area to the right. And it shows the competitiveness of public transport. And as you can see, the most yellow parts is where the competitiveness of public transport is very strong, and it's very few points. And in Nord-Jæren, there are none, and it's less than in Oslo. So you have to, when you implement ambitious transport policies and toll road structures and so on, you need to understand how there are different possibilities both within urban areas, but also between different urban areas in terms of in terms of how they are able to adapt to the new structures, how able they are to travel in climate-friendly ways. So if you take the next slide, to sum up, in terms of toll road structures, it's also important to understand how do the costs increase and to what level? How much is used for public transport, cycling and walking infrastructure? How much is used for cars? How much has it increased over the last 5 years, for example? And also, climate policy gives different groups burdens and advantages. It's important to acknowledge this and understand it. And good management of these policy packages and toll road schemes is crucial. And last, there are different interests and possibilities for climate-friendly transport, both within different parts of an urban region, but also between different urban regions. So, thank you.
Thank you very much, Anders, for this presentation. Now we will continue the discussion. If you would like to ask Tanya, Julia, or Anders a question, please write your question below here in the commentary field. And I'll start with asking Tanya and Julia, because you also mentioned the technology and how that is kind of putting the frame around everything that's happening now. What kind of discussions do you have with, for example, engineers?
Well, yes, you asked me. Yes, I am. I actually am an engineer, so I should know. I'm also anthropologist. So, but we have been working interdisciplinary, and first of all, I think that working with engineers is fantastic because we have a very clear distribution of roles. So the social scientists would know these things about people, and the technology people would know this, and it's very complementary. So I've had more discussions with working with economists, working from a behavioralistic, individualistic perspective on consumers being more individuals, whereas we would see them as social and so on. But to me, it's somehow the two ways to work with interdisciplinarity, where I favor the last one. But the first is to develop technology and then typically ask people to behave as expected, so to create social acceptance for that particular technology. Or you can do it vice versa. You can look at more holistically, what are the societal challenges within the field of electricity, for example, and then have those key questions which are already taking the holistic and the justice aspect up front, and then see what kind of technology, policies, other measures could actually provide that solution.
Julia, what would you like to add to this?
Well, I'm not an engineer, but I feel like I almost became one since I worked at DTU for 6 years or so. But I consider myself a techno-anthropologist. I've been, and when I started at DTU, there were only 2 of us, like social scientists, amongst several hundreds engineers and a few economists. So I have quite a bit of experience also in building up this interdisciplinary section. I really find it essential also to solve some of the challenges in the energy transition that we engage in such interdisciplinary, cross-disciplinary research. We cannot solve anything without that. I've in the beginning, I was often met with questions such as like, could you not develop a tool that we can put into the turbine so people will accept it more easily? And I was like, no, I'm sorry, but that's not how it works, or that's not how I'm working or thinking about it. I need to understand, go behind the people's opposition and not just try to fix it before I really understand people's concerns. And that has sometimes been, or it's been really interesting, but also I guess I also felt frustration on my own side, but also the engineer side. Well, why can you not work faster? Why do you need to first understand, spend time on doing all these interviews and asking people what they think and so on? But that is quite essential for my kind of research, obviously. But I really think that like a lot of learning comes from doing this, but it's not easy. But I just recently started a project that is essentially interdisciplinary, and where we really try to go against this technification of the issues, using the case of wind turbine noise, and saying, so okay, but engineers here at this place are really experts also in wind turbine noise and are trying to measure it and minimize it with all sorts of technical tools. But we also need to understand what is noise to people in their daily lives, and what is it that they feel and experience. So understanding different understandings or different types of knowledge, and so we can actually maybe co-create wind farms, or we need to engage more in a different way with people. So so I find it really an enormous task and very interesting, and but I think it really takes some efforts to develop that sort of common language to understand each other's background.
What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, this question about technology is very central within the sector of transport as well, because in Norway we had this tremendous electric car success. It's been very much used and implemented over the years. But that is the thing about the zero growth goal. It says that it frames the role of the car in the city. How should car be emphasized versus other forms of transport? Because electric cars also causes local air and noise pollution, accidents, congestion. So I think that the zero growth goal in Norway is important, as it addresses the role of the car, which involves many dimensions of sustainability, which is important, and not only this narrow climate focus.
When you are focusing on the fields of your research and then look across the border to your neighbors here in the Nordic countries, what do you see are the main areas where we really should collaborate more? Tanya.
Yes, I must admit I've been more collaborating with people in the global south, Africa, India, and within Norway, where Include now has this empirical focus. But I think, based on this, also the inputs we've had to glances, that we really need to, also as social scientists and also the interdisciplinary teams, to work across the countries. And one observation we've done is that within electricity is that there is very little focus in the policy and regulations on the social aspects. Whereas in the South, we recognize that women and men, for example, have different roles and responsibilities. Energy and climate policy in the North tend to be very gender blind. So that's one example, and where I think collaborating with social scientists across the Nordic countries would be very, very important.
Julia.
Yes, well, I very much agree with what you just said, Tanya. I'm looking with interest to EU calls for project like funding calls because they really tend to talk more and more about social science and humanities, and also the need for conducting more interdisciplinary research. But still, I think researchers are struggling to find out exactly how to do that, because as I just said before, it's not necessarily easy. And also I think the funding bodies need to figure out how to evaluate those cross-disciplinary or interdisciplinary research projects. What we could do more together is also thinking about joint calls for funding, I guess, and also calling for that we need more social science and humanities projects that have that more holistic view on the energy transition. I think that could help, because funnily enough, we haven't got a lot of projects with the Nordic countries. I've been working more with other countries, so that is a bit odd somehow. And there's so much, we have so different energy resources, and could think about it like this as a more integrated region where we could collaborate more, for sure.
That's a very interesting comment, and because from the Nordic Council of Ministers point of view, we have already mentioned Nordic Energy Research, but also Nordforsk, who are really trying to reach out to the top level researchers in our region to enableize more collaboration within also this field. So thank you for that comment, Julia. Anders, what are your take on this?
Yeah, I would say that there are huge possibilities for cooperation on research. While the Nordic countries are different, we share the overall political and administrative framework, so it's a very good basis for comparison, both of policy analysis, but also I would say that we have resembling urban structures, so focusing on how we could develop cities, sustainable cities, is a very promising path for comparison, I would say.
How is it possible for you to reach out to politicians and other stakeholders who actually make the decisions that affect the social sustainability, the social justice aspect? Would you really like to start? Oh, Tanya, sorry.
I thought that was the natural sequence now. Well, just to mention what we do in Include, the research center, we have 24 partners from municipalities, so thinking that we should work together with those who actually feel the problems and challenges in everyday regulations and management. So to learn from, because they possess all the kind of knowledge we need to actually understand and also contribute with research. But there is also a tension, so we put emphasis on that, and that was a requirement from the call for these environmentally sustainable centers that we form part of. So that can be encouraged also through the course. But then we also see maybe not a tension, but there could also be conflicting goals in that they want solutions and here and now, whereas we would also take a critical look at how they work. So we will also need to have that kind of academic freedom to also criticize, to have open and open view on what is going on and what could be improved. But I think that the way the calls are formulated invites for that kind of collaboration. But of course, we should also keep substantial amounts of funding also for the totally independent research. This should go in parallel.
Julia, I can see you're nodding.
Yeah, but I'm just basically agreeing very much. So the funding system, we really need to also talk to those formulating the calls, but also they are oftentimes really their framework is shaped by the politicians. So we shouldn't think about the politicians as outsiders. We somehow need to find new ways of engagement, but it is also a delicate balance, because we will also need to be professional and social scientists and have the freedom to conduct our critical research. But in our research, we at times try to engage with or conducting seminars where we invite local politicians and also national politicians. But it is something I think we should think about more carefully, also how to do that and who to include and exclude. But it's quite vital.
Anders, how do you do it at Cicero?
Yeah, referring to this Include Center, just following up what Tanya said, we've been given a very good structure for being policy relevant, because that's at the core of the center, and the center is long term. We have many years to work on this, and we emphasize very much communication and user contact and to be policy relevant. And over time, I hopefully we will succeed in raising the focus on social just transitions in Norway and abroad.
Yeah, Julia.
A few words more. So we have, as I said, different types of expertise in our section, also economists who are also informing the tariff system or how to support, to frame the support schemes. And so including social science perspectives for sociologists and informing that and providing some better policy advice for politicians and regulators. I think that is also what we're working on and will do more and more. That is important.
I can see, Tanya, that you're nodding.
Mm-hmm.
Would you like to add some final words?
No, is this session now approaching the end?
Yes, we will have to wrap up.
Yes. No, I think being invited in this kind of setting here, we can't see the audience, but I just presume that we would, and we would very much like to engage more directly with the audience today. If you have questions or comments or want to get into dialogue, we are most willing to come and present and share our results and approaches. So thank you very much.
Yes, well, the same from me and DTU Wind Energy. Yeah, and I've actually had quite a good collaboration with NTNU in Trondheim. So there is some really interesting overlaps and in interest and our research field. So yeah, I think it's really good to engage in this discussion about how to further that kind of Nordic collaboration.
Thank you very much, Anders, Julia, and Tanya, for participating in this panel debate. And this is it from the Nordic Energy Research Forum 2021. If you have any comments or additional questions, do not hesitate to contact Nordic Energy Research, and the whole team behind will most gladly answer and help you to get what you would like, almost. Regarding the presentations, at least, if you want them, do not hesitate to send us an email. Thank you very much.